In 1902, at the collision of Fifth Avenue and Broadway, a building rose from an impossible triangular plot and changed the skyline of New York forever. The Flatiron Building was born from a peculiar wedge of land at Madison Square that most builders had long considered unbuildable. Daniel Burnham, the visionary Chicago architect, refused to see a problem. He saw a destiny. Using revolutionary steel frame technology, his crew raised 21 stories in barely 12 months, and the city watched in open-mouthed disbelief. When the scaffolding came down, New York stopped in its tracks. Nothing like it had ever been seen before. Artists painted it. Photographers immortalized it. The winds at its base became legend, designated a landmark, and listed in the National Register of Historic Places. The Flatiron stands today exactly as it stood then, permanent, astonishing, and utterly unlike anything else on Earth. Continue this video before please like, comment, share, and subscribe this channel. Part 1. Iconic triangular skyscraper of New York. There are buildings that shelter men, and then there are buildings that haunt them. There are structures of stone and iron raised merely to serve a purpose, to hold offices, to house ledgers, to keep the rain from rusting the typewriters within. And then there are those rare, almost accidental monuments that rise up from the earth as though they were always meant to be there, as though the city itself had been quietly waiting for that particular shape to complete its skyline. The Flatiron Building is of the second kind. It belongs not simply to the history of New York, nor even to the longer and more tangled history of American ambition. It belongs to something older and stranger than either of those things. It belongs to the history of what happens when a man looks at a peculiar triangle of land where two great avenues collide and, instead of seeing a problem, sees a destiny. The year was 1902, and New York City was a place of tremendous noise and tremendous hunger. It was a city that ate iron and exhaled steam, a city that measured its greatness not by the wisdom of its citizens, but by the height of its towers. The great elevator buildings were already rising along Broadway and Lower Manhattan, dark cathedrals of commerce, competing for the attention of the clouds. Fortunes were being made and lost in a single afternoon. Immigrants poured through the harbor by the hundreds of thousands, each one carrying nothing more than a name and a willingness to become something new. The city had not yet decided what it was, and so it was everything at once, loud and contradictory and magnificent and terrible and alive in a way that no city before it had ever quite managed to be alive. Into this roaring, heaving, magnificent disorder came a building unlike anything the world had yet seen. The plot of land at the intersection of Fifth Avenue and Broadway, where those two great arteries of the city crossed at 23rd Street, had long been considered a nuisance. It was a narrow wedge, pinched at one end to a point so sharp it seemed almost cruel. A shape that most sensible builders regarded as unbuildable. For years it sat there, this awkward triangle of Manhattan earth, hosting a modest 5-story structure that few people remembered and fewer still admired. But Daniel Burnham, the great Chicago architect whose mind moved at a different angle from most men's minds, looked at that strange slice of the city and felt something quicken in him. He did not see a limitation. He saw the precise shape of an opportunity. Burnham's design was audacious by any measure of that word. 21 stories tall, clad in a skin of limestone and terracotta, the building was to rise from that impossible point like the prow of a great ship cutting through the intersection of the two avenues. It was to be a building shaped not by the convenience of the architect, but by the peculiar geometry of the land beneath it. And in surrendering to that geometry rather than fighting against it, Burnham produced something that no rectangular office tower, however grand, could ever quite achieve. He produced a silhouette, a shape so particular and so immediately recognizable that a person who had seen it only once in a photograph from 10,000 miles away could identify it instantly upon rounding a corner in Manhattan and finding it there, enormous and calm against the sky. The construction itself was a spectacle that drew crowds daily. New Yorkers, who considered themselves largely immune to wonder, found that they could not help stopping to watch. The steel skeleton rose floor by floor, through the winter and into the spring, and the workers who moved across those high beams were the subject of much newspaper attention. Described in breathless prose as men who walked among the clouds with the casual confidence of men who had never learned to be afraid. The building grew taller than any structure its neighbors had ever stood beside, and it did so with a kind of unhurried certainty, as though it had always known exactly how tall it meant to be. When it was finished, the reactions were as divided as the avenues that framed it. Some critics called it a masterpiece, a landmark that would define New York as surely as the great bridges had defined it. Others were less charitable. One particularly vocal detractor compared it to a stingy slice of pie left over after a dinner party and suggested that it would blow down in the first serious storm that came along. That prediction, as predictions of that kind so often do, proved embarrassingly incorrect. The Flatiron stood, as it has stood now for well over a century, through hurricanes and nor'easters and the particular atmospheric violence that New York reserves for its winters, utterly unmoved by the opinions of those who doubted it. What the critics had not anticipated, and what became apparent within months of the building's completion, was the effect it would have on the street below. The wedge shape of the structure created powerful wind currents at its base, and those winds, funneling down Fifth Avenue and across Broadway simultaneously, produced gusts of such unpredictable strength that women walking past often found their skirts lifted in a manner that the manners of the age considered scandalous. Young men, discovering this phenomenon with the enthusiasm characteristic of young men, took to gathering on 23rd Street specifically to observe it. The police, tasked with moving them along, reportedly coined the phrase 23 skidoo, an expression that entered the American vernacular and outlasted the scandal that produced it by several generations. But beyond the winds and the crowds and the newspaper columns and the policemen and the arguments among architects, there was something else the Flatiron Building did, something quieter and more lasting. It taught the city, and through the city the world, that the shape of a building need not be determined solely by practicality. That beauty was itself a kind of practicality, that a tower could be, all at once, an office and a landmark and a story, and that the story it told, the story of a city that refused to accept that any piece of land was too strange to build upon, was perhaps the most important structure of all. The Flatiron did not simply occupy its corner, it defined it. And in defining that corner, it defined something essential about New York itself, a city that never met an impossible angle it was not willing to build straight into the sky. Part 2. Land History. Built on a unique triangular plot at Madison Square. Before the building, there was the land, and before the land was anything of consequence, it was a problem. Not a dramatic problem, not the kind that fills newspapers or topples governments, but the quiet, stubborn, daily kind of problem that a city accumulates the way a coat accumulates dust, slowly and without ceremony, until one day someone holds it up to the light and wonders how it ever got so complicated. The triangular plot at the intersection of Fifth Avenue and Broadway, where those two great roads met and crossed at 23rd Street, like two old rivals who had finally run out of room to avoid each other, was that kind of problem. For decades, it sat at the heart of one of New York's most celebrated neighborhoods. Too small to be grand, too conspicuous to be ignored, and too oddly shaped for any builder of conventional ambition to know what to do with it. To understand what that land became, it is worth understanding first what it was. and what it had been long before New York was the kind of city that concerned itself with such distinctions. The island of Manhattan, in its earliest chapters, was a place of hills and marshes, and the kind of unruly geography that European settlers spent the better part of 2 centuries attempting to discipline into straight lines and right angles. The great grid plan that would eventually impose its orderly logic upon the island was not decreed until 1811, and even then it took generations for the city to grow northward into it. Below that grid, in the older neighborhoods, that had grown up according to the irregular logic of cow paths and creek beds and the simple human habit of walking wherever walking was easiest, the streets retained a wildness that no commissioner's map could entirely tame. Broadway was one of those streets. It had been a trail long before it was a road, cutting diagonally across the island in defiance of the grid that would later try to contain it, and its refusal to run parallel with anything else in the city was precisely what made it, and the triangular lots its diagonal course created, so perpetually troublesome to builders and so perpetually interesting to everyone else. The land that would one day hold the Flatiron Building had been, in earlier times, part of the shifting landscape north of the old city, a district that grew and changed with each decade as New York expanded its ambitions. By the middle of the 19th century, the area around 23rd Street and Madison Square had become one of the most fashionable addresses in the entire city. Madison Square Park, which occupied the land to the east, was a place of promenades and fine carriages, of gentlemen in tall hats and ladies in enormous skirts, who came to see and to be seen in the particular manner that prosperous New Yorkers had always regarded as both a social obligation and a competitive sport. The hotels and clubs and brownstone residences that lined the surrounding streets were among the finest in the country, and the neighborhood wore its elegance with the easy confidence of a place that has never had any reason to doubt itself. It was in this gilded district that the wedge of land at the convergence of Fifth Avenue and Broadway sat through the decades like an uninvited guest at a very elegant dinner party. Its peculiar shape made it difficult to develop in the manner that the surrounding neighborhood demanded. While grand buildings rose on the rectangular lots nearby, the triangular plot went through a series of modest occupants, none of them remarkable, none of them staying long enough to leave much impression on the street or on the memory of the people who passed by. There was a time when a hotel called the Cumberland occupied a portion of it. There were years when it held buildings so forgettable that the newspapers of the day barely troubled to name them. The land was valuable, positioned as it was at one of the most visible corners in a city that was rapidly becoming the most important in the world, but its shape defeated the conventional imagination, and so it waited, as awkward land often waits, for someone unconventional enough to see its possibilities. The neighborhood itself was changing by the time the 19th century gave way to the 20th. The very fashionability that had made Madison Square so desirable in the decades following the Civil War had begun to migrate northward, as fashion in New York always eventually did, following the money up the island toward the newer and more spacious blocks of the upper city. The grand hotels were still there, and the park still drew its crowds. But there was a sense in certain circles that the district's finest hour might be behind it, that the center of gravity in New York's social life was shifting toward Fifth Avenue further north, toward the great mansions that the Vanderbilts and their kind were raising like private kingdoms on the upper stretches of the avenue. Against this backdrop of neighborhood transition, the sale of the triangular plot to the Fuller Construction Company in 1901 was the kind of transaction that might have passed largely unremarked. Just one more piece of Manhattan changing hands in a city where land was always changing hands, always moving from one set of ambitions to another. But the Fuller Company had engaged Daniel Burnham, and Burnham had looked at that pointed, impossible, magnificent triangle and understood something about it that no previous owner had managed to grasp. He understood that the peculiarity of the land was not its weakness, It was its entire point. Every rectangular lot in New York would produce, in the hands of a competent architect, a rectangular building, and the city was already full of those. But this land, this narrow wedge, squeezed between two of the most famous avenues in the world, this land could only ever produce one thing. It could produce a shape that no one would ever mistake for anything else. A silhouette so specific to its corner, so inseparable from the particular geometry of the streets that made it, that to look at it would be to understand immediately and completely where in the world you were standing. The land had been waiting through all its long and undistinguished history, not for a builder practical enough to make use of it. It had been waiting for one visionary enough to honor it. Part 3. Design. Architect Daniel Burnham created the wedge-shaped design. There are architects who design buildings, and then there are architects who design inevitabilities. The first kind are skilled and necessary and deserving of every honor the profession bestows upon them. They read a site, they calculate the loads, they satisfy the client and appease the city, and produce something solid and useful, and occasionally even beautiful. Something that serves its purpose for a generation or two, before being quietly replaced by something newer and more efficient. The second kind are rarer and stranger, and considerably more difficult to live with, because they do not see land the way ordinary men see land. They see it the way a sculptor sees a block of stone, not as a surface to be built upon, but as a proposition to be answered, a question the earth itself is asking. And they spend their entire professional lives listening for the question beneath the question, the one that no client has ever thought to put into words. Daniel Hudson Burnham was unmistakably of the second kind, and the Flatiron Building was, in every line and proportion and ornamental detail of its extraordinary form, the answer to a question that the triangular plot at 23rd Street had been asking since the day the city's two greatest avenues first converged upon it. Burnham came to New York with a reputation already large enough to precede him by several city blocks. He had made his name in Chicago, that other great American city of iron and nerve, where the fire of 1871 had burned away the old order and left behind a blank and smoking canvas, upon which an entirely new kind of architecture was being invented almost daily. He had worked alongside the brilliant and tormented Louis Sullivan, had watched the great John Root die too young and too soon, had taken the reins of their shared firm and driven it forward through sheer force of organizational will, and an aesthetic vision that was confident without being arrogant, ambitious without being reckless. He had also been the master planner of the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago, that extraordinary dream city of white classical buildings erected along the lakeshore, which had dazzled 27 million visitors and fundamentally altered the way Americans thought about what a city could look like if someone with sufficient vision and sufficient determination was given the freedom to imagine it whole. When the Fuller Construction Company retained Burnham to design their New York building, they were acquiring not merely an architect, but an entire philosophy of what a building owed to its surroundings. Burnham believed, with the conviction of a man who has thought carefully about a thing for a very long time, that a building of significance must engage honestly with the conditions of its site, rather than imposing upon them some foreign and indifferent geometry. It was a belief that placed him at a certain angle to the prevailing fashion of his day, which tended toward the monumental and the symmetrical, toward facades that announced their importance through sheer breadth and repetition. Burnham had nothing against importance. He simply felt that importance, like everything else worth having, was better earned than declared. The design he produced for the Fuller Building, as it was originally named before the public rechristened it, with the far more vivid and lasting name it wears today, was a building in the Beaux-Arts tradition, rooted in the classical language of columns and cornices, and carefully graduated ornamentation that Burnham had absorbed and made his own during the Chicago years and the Great Exposition. It rose 21 stories from its triangular base, its facades divided in the manner of a classical column into 3 distinct zones: a base, a shaft, and a capital, each one articulated with the kind of ornamental richness that the Beaux-Arts tradition demanded, and that Burnham delivered with the unhurried confidence of a man who understood that decoration, properly conceived and properly executed, was not an indulgence but a discipline. The material he chose for the exterior was limestone and terracotta, both of them pale and almost luminous in certain lights, giving the building a quality of brightness against the sky that its darker neighbors could not match. The terracotta was shaped into an elaborate program of Renaissance and Flemish ornamental motifs, foliate panels and classical medallions, and decorative string courses that wrapped the building's unusual form in a continuous skin of considered detail. At the narrow northern point, where the 2 facades met at their sharpest angle, Burnham designed the junction with particular care, rounding the edge slightly, rather than allowing it to terminate in the knife-sharp point that the geometry of the site might have suggested, a decision that was at once practical and deeply elegant, giving the building a sense of living completeness rather than geometric accident. What Burnham understood, and what his design so brilliantly expressed, was that the wedge shape of the building was not merely a concession to the shape of the land, but was in fact the building's greatest structural and aesthetic asset. Because the Flatiron narrowed from south to north, its facades met the avenues at angles rather than head-on, and this meant that a person approaching it from almost any direction along either Fifth Avenue or Broadway encountered it not as a flat wall, but as a receding, dynamic form, a building that appeared to be in motion even when standing perfectly still, a building that changed its aspect and its apparent size and weight with every step the observer took. No rectangular building, however skillfully proportioned, could produce this effect. It required the particular geometry of the wedge, and it required an architect who understood that geometry not as a constraint, but as an instrument. The steel frame that supported all of this was itself a relatively new technology, one that Burnham and his colleagues in Chicago had done much to develop and refine. And its use here allowed the building to achieve heights and floor plans that traditional masonry construction could never have managed on so narrow a footprint. But the steel was invisible, buried within the building's mass, and Burnham made no effort to express it on the exterior, preferring instead to clothe his iron skeleton in the warm, humanist vocabulary of the classical tradition he loved. The result was a building that was modern in its structure and timeless in its surface, a building that belonged entirely to its moment in history and simultaneously to no moment at all. It was, in the fullest sense of a word that is too often used carelessly, a masterpiece, and it announced, to a city that was still learning the full dimensions of its own possibilities, that architecture was not merely the art of putting up buildings, it was the art of asking the land what it wanted to become. Part 4. Construction. Built quickly, using modern steel frame technology, 1901 to 1902. There is a particular kind of miracle that the modern world has grown so accustomed to witnessing that it has almost entirely lost the capacity to be astonished by it. It is the miracle of a building going up, not the finished building, not the polished and populated thing that people eventually come to regard as permanent and inevitable, but the raw and violent and daily miracle of its becoming. The steel rising floor by floor against the sky, the workers moving across those high and windswept beams with their buckets and their rivet guns, the whole improbable enterprise of turning a hole in the ground into something that touches the clouds, accomplished not by magic, but by the organized and relentless application of human labor and human ingenuity, working together under conditions that would have struck any sensible person, observing them from the safety of the pavement below as thoroughly unsurvivable. When the Flatiron Building went up in 1901 and 1902, New York had not yet grown accustomed to the miracle. and so the city watched. The Fuller Construction Company, which had commissioned Daniel Burnham's design and would give the building its original name before the public overruled them with something better, was among the most capable building contractors in the country. They had experience with the new steel frame construction methods that had been developed and refined in Chicago over the preceding 2 decades. Methods that represented as fundamental a revolution in the art of building as the printing press had represented in the art of communication. Before the steel frame, a building's height was limited by the thickness of its walls. The higher you went, the thicker the walls at the base had to be to support the weight above them. And there came a point, reached relatively quickly, at which the walls consumed so much of the ground floor that the building ceased to be useful as anything other than a demonstration of its own structural ambition. The steel frame changed this entirely. By transferring the load of the building not to its walls, but to an internal skeleton of riveted steel columns and beams, it liberated the exterior from the burden of support and allowed the walls to become, in effect, a curtain, a skin stretched over a frame, free to be as thin and as decorative as the architect desired. It was this technology that made the Flatiron possible, and not merely possible but achievable within a time frame that would have been unthinkable under the old masonry methods. The construction of the building, from the driving of the first foundation piles into the bedrock of Manhattan to the completion of the final ornamental terracotta panels on the uppermost floors, was accomplished in a period of roughly 12 months. 12 months to raise 21 stories on one of the most peculiarly shaped and most publicly scrutinized building sites in the entire city. It was a pace that astonished even the seasoned observers of New York's building trade. Men who had watched the city's skyline transform itself with great speed over the preceding decade, and who had grown relatively difficult to impress. The foundation work was the first great challenge, and it was a challenge that the triangular shape of the plot made considerably more complex than it might otherwise have been. The bedrock beneath Manhattan lies at varying depths, and in this part of the island it sat deep enough to require the driving of caissons down through the soft upper soil before the steel columns could be properly anchored. This was work done largely below the sightline of the curious New Yorkers, who had already begun gathering on the pavement to observe the spectacle, and it was unglamorous and slow and absolutely essential, the kind of foundational labor that receives none of the attention lavished on the visible drama of the rising steel, but upon which every subsequent act of the performance entirely depends. The men who did it worked in conditions of mud and confined darkness and considerable physical danger, and they did their work with the matter-of-fact endurance that the building trades of that era demanded and largely received. Once the foundations were secured and the steel erection began in earnest, the pace of the work became something genuinely extraordinary to watch. The structural steel for the Flatiron had been fabricated off-site, each piece cut and shaped and drilled to specification before arriving at 23rd Street, so that the process of assembly on the ground proceeded with a speed and efficiency that seemed almost mechanical in its precision. The ironworkers who caught and positioned and riveted the steel members were among the most celebrated and most feared tradesmen in the city, men who worked at heights that the ordinary imagination prefers not to contemplate, moving across the skeletal framework of the rising building, with a practiced ease that spectators on the street below found alternately thrilling and nauseating. They were paid well for their work and for their nerves, and they carried themselves with the particular confidence of men who know that they possess a skill that very few others are willing or able to acquire. The riveting gangs that followed behind the steel erectors were their own kind of spectacle. A riveting gang typically consisted of 4 men working in close and almost wordless coordination. A heater who brought the iron rivets to the correct temperature in a small portable furnace. A catcher who received the glowing rivet tossed to him across open air with a metal cone. A bucker-up who held the rivet in place from one side of the joint, and a riveter who hammered it home from the other. The rhythm of their work, the clang and thud of metal against metal, repeated hundreds of times across the face of the rising building, from early morning until the light failed, became the soundtrack of that particular corner of the city for the better part of a year. A percussion that residents and shopkeepers and passers-by either learned to tune out or grew to find strangely reassuring. Proof that the city was, as always, building itself further into the future. By the spring of 1902, the steel was complete, and the limestone and terracotta cladding was being applied to the exterior in its carefully ordered layers, transforming the raw industrial skeleton into the refined and ornamented surface that Burnham had designed and that the world would come to know. The building was ready for occupancy later that year, and when its tenants moved in and its elevators began their daily journeys up and down those 21 floors, the construction crews moved on to the next job, as construction crews always do, leaving behind them a building so complete and so composed in its finished form that it was already becoming difficult to imagine that it had ever been anything other than exactly what it now was: permanent, inevitable, and, to anyone who had watched it rise from nothing in the space of a single extraordinary year, nothing short of a miracle. Part 5. Public reaction. People were amazed by its unusual shape. New York City in 1902 was not a place that was easily surprised. It was a city that had seen too much, digested too much of the world's strangeness to be caught off guard by anything as modest as a new building. However tall, however expensive, however loudly its developers chose to announce it. The city had watched the Brooklyn Bridge go up. It had watched the elevated railways thread their iron bones through the air above its crowded streets. It had watched waves of humanity arrive from every corner of the globe and remake themselves within a single generation into something that could plausibly be called American. New York was, in the truest sense of the phrase, unshockable. And yet, when the Flatiron Building emerged from its scaffolding in the latter months of 1902 and presented its finished face to the intersection of Fifth Avenue and Broadway, the city stopped. Not all at once, not with any single dramatic collective gasp, but in the way that a crowd stops when something genuinely unprecedented appears among them. Gradually, person by person, each one slowing, and then halting, and then standing with their head tilted at that particular angle. That means the mind is working hard to process something it has never quite encountered before. The shape was the thing. It was always the shape. New Yorkers were accustomed to tall buildings by the time the Flatiron arrived. The city had been growing upward for the better part of 2 decades, and a 21-story tower, while impressive, was no longer the kind of thing that stopped traffic on its own. What stopped traffic was the form that those 21 stories took. The way the building came to its narrow northern point, like the prow of an ocean liner that had somehow run aground at 23rd Street. The way it presented not a broad, flat face to the street, but a constantly shifting profile that changed its character entirely depending on where you stood to look at it. From directly to the south, it appeared almost impossibly thin, a razor of stone and terracotta that seemed to have no interior, no depth, no substance beyond its own silhouette against the sky. From Broadway to the west, it opened into a commanding and surprisingly massive presence. From Fifth Avenue to the east, it presented an altogether different aspect again, wider and more settled, a building that had found its proper angle at last. No single viewpoint contained the whole truth of it, and this was precisely what kept people walking around it, unable to commit to any one impression, always suspecting that the next angle might finally reveal the definitive version of what they were looking at. The newspapers, which in that era served the function that social media would later usurp, seized upon the building with the enthusiasm of institutions that recognize a good story when it materializes on a famous street corner. The coverage was immediate and extensive, and in the manner of newspaper coverage of anything genuinely extraordinary, deeply contradictory. Some writers celebrated the Flatiron as a monument to American ingenuity and the bold forward spirit of the age, a building that proved New York's architects were not afraid to tear up the old rulebook and write something entirely new in its place. Others were considerably less charitable. One critic, whose name history has not thought worth preserving, described the building as a mistake made permanent in limestone. Another suggested that it resembled a great ship going nowhere, all prow and no passage. A vessel that had forgotten the purpose of a vessel. The architectural establishment produced its own mixed chorus of admiration and disapproval, though even those who disapproved could rarely resist visiting the corner to see the thing for themselves before passing judgment on it. Among ordinary New Yorkers, those who were not critics and not architects and not employed by any newspaper, the reaction was considerably more uncomplicated. They found it wonderful, not wonderful in the careful, qualified way of people who have been educated into a set of aesthetic opinions they feel obliged to defend, but wonderful in the older and more honest sense of the word, full of wonder, full of the genuine and unmediated delight that an unusual thing produces in a person who has not yet been taught to pretend that delight requires justification. Children pointed at it. Workers on their lunch hour walked out of their way to stand before it. Visitors who had come to New York on business found themselves standing at 23rd Street longer than any business errand could reasonably account for, tilting their heads and walking slowly around the corner and then walking back again, doing the thing that every person did upon first encountering the Flatiron, which was trying to find the angle that made it make sense, and discovering, with a mixture of frustration and pleasure, that no such angle existed. The wind, which has already been mentioned in connection with the building's peculiar effect on the street-level atmosphere of 23rd Street, became its own chapter in the story of the public reaction. The currents produced by the wedge shape of the building at its base were strong and unpredictable and entirely democratic in their attentions, lifting the hats from the heads of gentlemen and the skirts from the legs of ladies with equal and impartial enthusiasm. The ladies were not amused. The gentlemen who gathered specifically to observe the ladies' predicament were rather more so. The police officers assigned to disperse these gatherings were professionally obligated to be amused by nothing at all, though the human being beneath the uniform occasionally struggled to maintain this position. The phrase that the officers reportedly used to move the loitering crowds along, 23 skidoo, passed into the vernacular with a speed that suggested a city delighted to have a new expression for an old situation, the situation being one person telling another person to go away, which New York had always managed perfectly well without a catchphrase, but seemed relieved to finally have one. Artists and photographers found in the Flatiron an inexhaustible subject. Alfred Stieglitz photographed it in winter, the building emerging from a blur of snow and bare trees in Madison Square Park, its upper floors dissolving into a sky that seemed to have no top. And the image he produced became one of the most celebrated photographs of the early 20th century, proof that a building could be a work of art in itself, without any additional assistance from the people who pointed cameras at it. Edward Steichen photographed it at night, its lit windows floating against a dark sky above the wet gleam of the street below. The building transformed by darkness and reflection into something that bore very little resemblance to the practical office tower it was during the hours of business. Painters approached it from every direction and in every weather, each one attempting to catch in pigment the thing that made the building so resistant to being fully known. What all of these reactions had in common: the wonder and the criticism and the comedy of the skirts, and the artistry of the photographs and the long, slow walks around the corner that New Yorkers of every description took throughout that first extraordinary year, was that they were all responses to a building that had refused to be ordinary. The Flatiron had arrived in a city of extraordinary buildings and had immediately distinguished itself from all of them, not by being taller or grander or more expensively ornamented, but simply by being unlike anything that had come before it, and in a city that prided itself on having seen everything that was the rarest and most valuable thing of all. Part 6, Cultural Impact, became one of the most photographed buildings in New York. There is a difference between a building that is famous and a building that is beloved, and it is a difference that matters more than most people who discuss architecture ever pause to acknowledge. Famous buildings are everywhere. Every major city has them, those towers and monuments and civic halls that appear on postcards and in guidebooks, and that tourists feel obligated to stand before and photograph, not because the sight of them produces any particular feeling, but because the culture has decreed that standing before them is a thing that ought to be done. Beloved buildings are something rarer and something deeper. They are the ones that people return to, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine and often inarticulate need. The ones that have embedded themselves so thoroughly into the emotional landscape of a place that to remove them would be to remove something that cannot be easily named, but would be immediately and painfully felt. The Flatiron Building became both kinds of famous with remarkable speed. But it was the second kind, the beloved kind, that turned out to matter most, and that secured for it a place in the cultural life of New York that no amount of architectural distinction alone could ever have guaranteed. The process by which a building passes from novelty to icon is rarely a straightforward one, and it rarely follows the intentions of the people who built it. The Fuller Construction Company had raised their building to house offices and generate revenue. Practical ambitions that the building fulfilled with quiet efficiency for years, without anyone paying much attention to the business conducted within its triangular walls. What they had not anticipated, could not reasonably have anticipated, was that the building would be adopted by the culture of the city in a way that went far beyond anything the ledgers of a construction company were designed to measure. Artists had begun photographing and painting it almost from the moment the scaffolding came down, and their work circulated first in galleries and exhibitions, and later in the new illustrated magazines that were reaching mass audiences for the first time, carried the image of the Flatiron far beyond the boundaries of New York, and far beyond the reach of anyone who had ever stood at the corner of 23rd Street and looked up at it with their own eyes. Alfred Stieglitz, whose winter photograph of the building had already established it as a subject worthy of serious artistic attention, understood something about the Flatiron that the purely architectural critics had missed. He understood that it was not merely a building of unusual shape, but a building of unusual feeling that it produced in the person who stood before it. An emotional response that was not easily categorized and not easily dismissed, something between awe and tenderness, between the admiration one feels for a great feat of engineering and the affection one feels for a face that has become familiar and dear through long acquaintance. His photographs did not merely document the building, they interpreted it, finding in its stone and terracotta and the particular quality of the light that gathered around its upper floors, a mood that was distinctly and irreducibly New York, melancholy and energetic at once, solitary and surrounded, ancient in feeling and relentlessly modern in fact. The painters who followed where Stieglitz had led found in the Flatiron an equally generous subject. The Ashcan School, that group of realist painters who had committed themselves in the early years of the 20th century to depicting New York life in all its crowded and unglamorous and magnificent particularity, returned to the building again and again, placing it in the backgrounds of street scenes and market scenes and winter park scenes, using it as a kind of visual anchor that told the viewer immediately and precisely where in the world the scene was taking place. It became, in this way, a shorthand for the city itself, a single image that could carry the weight of everything New York meant, its energy and its strangeness and its peculiar beauty, without requiring a single word of explanation. As the 20th century advanced, and the mass media expanded its reach and its appetite, the Flatiron's image spread through the culture with the unstoppable momentum of a thing that has found its moment and refuses to release it. It appeared on magazine covers and in film backgrounds and on the merchandise that the city's souvenir trade produced in ever-increasing quantities. For the ever-increasing numbers of visitors who arrived in New York from every part of the world, and felt, many of them, that the Flatiron was something they needed to see with their own eyes before they could feel they had truly been to the city. It was reproduced in miniature on keychains and snow globes and ceramic tiles and every other object that the souvenir imagination could conceive of. And each reproduction, however modest and however far removed from the grandeur of the original, carried with it some faint trace of the feeling that the building itself produced. That combination of delight and disbelief that a triangular skyscraper standing 21 stories tall at one of the most famous intersections in the world reliably provoked in everyone who encountered it for the first time. The neighborhood that grew up around the building absorbed its identity and eventually took its name. The Flatiron District, as the area around 23rd Street and Madison Square came to be known, underwent its own remarkable transformation in the latter decades of the 20th century, evolving from a somewhat faded commercial zone into one of the most sought-after addresses in Manhattan for the creative and technology industries that were remaking the city's economic character. The building stood at the center of this transformation, not as a passive backdrop, but as an active presence, lending its name and its image and its considerable accumulated prestige to a neighborhood that understood it was in possession of something rare, a landmark that was not merely famous, but generative, capable of conferring upon its surroundings a sense of identity and purpose and belonging that most neighborhoods spend decades trying to manufacture and never quite manage to produce. What the Flatiron Building became, in the more than a century that followed its completion, was something that no architect can design for, and no construction company can build, and no developer can purchase. No matter how large the budget or how skilled the team, it became a symbol, not in the thin and arbitrary way of symbols that are assigned their meaning by committees and marketing departments, but in the deep and organic way of symbols that earn their meaning through long and intimate acquaintance with the people who live alongside them, who walk past them every morning on their way to work and every evening on their way home, who measure the changing of the seasons by the quality of the light that falls across their facades, who feel, in a way they would struggle to articulate but would not for a moment doubt, that the building is in some sense theirs. That is the rarest achievement in all of architecture, and the Flatiron Building. Part 7, Preservation. Recognized and protected as a historic landmark. There comes a moment in the life of every great building when its continued existence ceases to be a matter of course and becomes, instead, a matter of choice. It is a moment that arrives quietly, without announcement, somewhere in the long middle passage between the excitement of a building's completion and the distant horizon of its presumed permanence. And it arrives in the form of a question that cities have been asking about their oldest and most significant structures for as long as cities have had the means to tear things down, and the occasional wisdom to wonder whether they should. The question is simple enough to state and enormously complicated to answer. Is this building worth keeping? Not worth keeping in the practical sense, not worth keeping because it still functions efficiently, or because its floors are sound and its elevators run on time, but worth keeping in the deeper and more contested sense. Worth keeping because it holds within its walls something that cannot be rebuilt once it is gone. Something that belongs not only to the people who own it or occupy it, but to the broader and less easily defined community of everyone who has ever stood before it and felt, in however vague and unexamined a way, that the world was better for its presence, For the Flatiron Building, that question was eventually answered with a formal and legal clarity that few buildings ever achieve. But the path to that answer was neither simple nor swift. The first decades of the 20th century were not in general kind to the proposition that old buildings deserved protection for their own sake. New York was a city in a permanent state of self-reinvention, a city that regarded the past with the impatient affection of a person who loves their parents but cannot quite bring themselves to live in the family home. Buildings went up and buildings came down, and the speed of both processes was regarded as a sign of vitality rather than a cause for concern. The Great Pennsylvania Station, one of the most magnificent public buildings ever erected on American soil, was demolished in 1963 with a casualness that stunned the architectural world and galvanized almost immediately a movement of citizens and scholars and preservationists who understood that they had just watched something irreplaceable vanish from the face of the earth and were determined that it should not happen again. The loss of Penn Station was, in this sense, a catastrophe that produced its own remedy. It provoked the city of New York to take the question of architectural preservation seriously in a way it never quite had before. And the institution that emerged most directly from that provocation was the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. Established by law in 1965 with the authority to designate buildings and districts as landmarks, and thereby place them under the protection of the city against demolition or unsympathetic alteration, the Flatiron Building was designated a New York City landmark in 1966, just 1 year after the commission that would protect it was called into being. That timing was not entirely coincidental. The building had always been recognized in the informal and unlegislated way that cities recognize their most cherished places, as something that belonged to New York in a way that transcended the usual relationship between a city and its real estate. But informal recognition, however widespread and however heartfelt, offers no protection against the economics of development, against the cold arithmetic of a site assessment that weighs the value of what stands on a piece of land against the value of what could be built in its place. The landmark designation converted that informal and sentimental understanding into a legal and enforceable fact, placing the Flatiron Building beyond the reach of the demolition order and the developer's calculation, and securing for it a future that its admirers had always assumed it possessed, but had never quite managed to guarantee. The designation acknowledged, in the formal language of civic law, what artists and photographers and ordinary New Yorkers had been saying in their own various languages for more than 6 decades. It acknowledged that the building's value was not reducible to its utility, not measurable in square footage or rental income, or any of the other metrics by which the real estate industry customarily assigns worth to the structures it trades. It acknowledged that there existed another kind of value, harder to quantify but no less real, the value of a building that had become part of the city's memory, part of the story that New York told about itself and that the world told about New York. A value that accumulated not over the course of a single transaction but over the course of generations of human experience, lived in the shadow and the presence of a particular place. In 1989, the recognition extended further still when the Flatiron Building was added to the National Register of Historic Places, that federal inventory of the nation's cultural and historical heritage, which represents the highest formal acknowledgement that the United States government can bestow upon a structure that has earned a permanent place in the American story. The federal designation brought with it not only additional layers of protection, but also a statement of significance that reached beyond the boundaries of New York City and beyond the particular attachment of New Yorkers to their most celebrated triangular building. It declared, in effect, that the Flatiron belonged to the country as much as to the city, that its story was woven into the broader fabric of American architectural and cultural history, and deserved to be preserved on those grounds regardless of whatever commercial pressures might arise to argue otherwise. The physical work of preservation, The unglamorous and technically demanding business of maintaining a building of this age and complexity in a condition worthy of its significance has been a continuous and costly undertaking across the decades. The terracotta ornamental panels that clad the building's exterior, so admired when they were new, required ongoing inspection and repair as the inevitable processes of weathering and thermal expansion worked their slow damage upon the material. The limestone facade demanded regular cleaning and repointing. The interior, which had been modified numerous times over the course of the building's working life to accommodate the changing needs of its tenants, required careful management to balance the legitimate demands of contemporary occupancy against the obligation to maintain the historic character of the spaces within. None of this work was simple, and none of it was cheap, and all of it was necessary because preservation is not a single act, but a permanent commitment. Not a decision made once and then forgotten, but a discipline practiced daily against the entropy that time inflicts upon every human construction, without exception or mercy. What the preservation of the Flatiron Building ultimately represents, beyond the legal designations and the maintenance schedules and the careful stewardship of its physical fabric, is a decision about what a city owes to itself and to the people who will inhabit it long after the current generation has gone. It is a decision that some things cannot be replaced, once lost, that the accumulated meaning of a building that has stood at the heart of a great city for more than a century cannot be recreated from scratch, no matter how skilled the architect or how generous the budget, and that the proper response to the existence of such a building is not to marvel at it from a distance and then allow the pressures of the moment to gradually erode the commitment to its survival, but to protect it with the full force of the law and the full seriousness of civic purpose. New York made that decision for the Flatiron, and in doing so, made it for every person who will ever round a corner on Fifth Avenue or Broadway and find the building there, exactly where Burnham placed it, permanent and astonishing and entirely, irreplaceably itself. Part 8, Legacy, remains an iconic symbol of early skyscraper architecture. Legacy is a word that gets handed out too freely in an age that has grown impatient with the slow and unannounced way that genuine legacies actually form. We speak of the legacy of things that happened last year, of people who are still alive and still revising the terms of their own story, as though significance were something that could be declared rather than accumulated, awarded rather than earned through the long and indifferent passage of time. Real legacy is quieter than that, and considerably more demanding. It does not arrive with a ceremony or a plaque or a press release. It arrives in the form of an influence so thoroughly absorbed into the fabric of the world that the world can no longer easily imagine itself without it. An influence that operates not as a discrete and visible thing, but as a kind of atmospheric condition, present everywhere and acknowledged almost nowhere, shaping the thoughts and the work of people who may never have consciously considered its source. By that measure, the true measure, the Flatiron Building has a legacy as substantial and as durable as any structure raised by human hands in the long and ambitious history of American architecture. And it has earned every particle of it through more than a century of quiet, unwavering, magnificent presence. The building's most immediate and most legible contribution to architectural history was the demonstration, visible to anyone who cared to stand at the corner of 23rd Street and look, that the steel-frame skyscraper was not merely a functional instrument, but an aesthetic one, not merely a machine for the efficient vertical stacking of office floors, but a vehicle for the expression of ideas about form and beauty and the relationship between a building and the city that surrounds it. Before the Flatiron, the skyscraper was still finding its identity, still working out the terms of its own existence, still uncertain whether it ought to look like a classical column or a Gothic tower or something entirely without precedent. The Flatiron did not resolve that uncertainty for the entire tradition, but it demonstrated something more important than any single stylistic answer could have provided. It demonstrated that the question itself was worth asking seriously, that the outward form of a tall building was a matter of genuine consequence and genuine creative opportunity, and that an architect who brought both rigorous thought and genuine feeling to that question could produce something that transcended the category of commercial construction and entered the more demanding and more lasting category of art. The architects who came after Burnham and who shaped the extraordinary flowering of skyscraper design that New York experienced through the 1920s and 30s, those years when the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building and the great Art Deco towers of Midtown rose in rapid and astonishing succession to define the silhouette that the world would forever associate with the city, did not build as Burnham had built. Their aesthetic was different. Their ornamental vocabulary was different. The relationship to the classical tradition was different in almost every particular. But they shared with Burnham the conviction that a tall building was an occasion for architecture in the fullest sense of that word. That height and ambition and the particular drama of a structure that punctuates the sky demanded a response equal to the scale of the opportunity. That conviction, which the Flatiron had expressed so early and so forcefully, ran like a current through the entire golden age of the American skyscraper, and its source, however rarely acknowledged in the architectural histories of that period, lay in no small part at the narrow northern point of a triangular building at 23rd Street. Beyond its influence on the architects who followed it, the Flatiron Building left a legacy in the broader culture that is, if anything, even more remarkable for being so entirely unplanned. It became, in the course of its long life, one of the defining images of New York, which is to say, one of the defining images of modernity itself. Since for much of the 20th century, New York and modernity were understood to be more or less the same thing. The silhouette of the Flatiron, that unmistakable wedge against the sky, appeared in the backgrounds of films and the pages of novels and the compositions of photographers working in every tradition, from documentary realism to surrealist fantasy, each one finding in its particular form a different metaphor for a different aspect of the city's inexhaustible meaning. It was modern, and it was old. It was monumental, and it was intimate. It was aggressive in its ambition and gentle in its detail. It contained multitudes in the way that only the greatest works of human making ever managed to contain them, offering each person who looked at it something genuinely different from what every other person found, while remaining, through all of these varied encounters, entirely and unmistakably itself. The generations of architects and designers and students of the built environment who have studied the Flatiron Building in the more than a century since its completion have returned repeatedly to a question that the building raises with particular insistence and particular elegance. The question is whether the constraints of a site, its irregularities and its difficulties and its departures from the convenient and the standard, are obstacles to be overcome or opportunities to be embraced. Every generation of architects hears this question differently and answers it differently, and the answers they give are shaped by the technological possibilities and the aesthetic fashions and the cultural pressures of their own particular moment. But the question itself, the essential question of what a building owes to the specific and irreplaceable piece of earth on which it stands, was never asked more beautifully or answered more completely than it was by Daniel Burnham on that impossible triangular plot at the intersection of Fifth Avenue and Broadway in the opening years of the 20th century. To stand before the Flatiron Building today, in the second decade of the 21st century, more than 120 years after the last rivet was driven and the last terracotta panel set in place, is to experience something that very few buildings of any age or any country are capable of producing in the person who stands before them. It is to feel the full and undiminished force of an original idea. The building has not faded, It has not been diminished by familiarity or buried under the accumulated weight of its own reputation. It stands as it has always stood, at the confluence of two great avenues, its pale stone catching the light of whatever season the sky above it happens to be wearing. Its narrow point, aimed northward with a certainty that has never wavered. Its presence as immediate and as commanding, and as quietly extraordinary as it was on the first morning that New York woke up to find it there. That is the Flatiron's true legacy. Not an influence, not a chapter in a history book, not a designation on a register, but a living and irreducible proof that when a great architect meets a great piece of land with a great idea, the result can be something that time itself declines to diminish. Something that endures not because the law protects it, though the law does protect it, but because the world, in its deepest and least articulable instincts, refuses to let it go.